There will be a wicked counsel planned and prepared that will change the countenance of the church. Many will lose the faith. Confusion will reign everywhere. The sheep will search for their shepherds in vain. A schism will tear apart the holy tunic of my Son. This will be the end of times, foretold in the Holy Scriptures and recalled to memory by me in many places. The abomination of abominations will reach its peak, and it will bring the chastisement announced at La Salette. My Son's arm, which I will not be able to hold back anymore, will punish this poor world, which must expiate its crimes. One will only speak about wars and revolutions. The elements of nature will be unchained and will cause anguish even among the best, the most courageous. The church will bleed from all her wounds. Happy are they who will persevere and search for refuge in my heart, because in the end, my immaculate heart will triumph. After this, the priest heard only one more sentence. This is the third secret of Fatima. So note here, it says the sheep will search for their shepherds in vain. Why? Because it is almost impossible to find a Catholic priest today. And by a Catholic priest, I mean one in communion with the true Pope, with Pope Gregory XVIII. But you can easily find tons of Sedevacantists, SSPX, of course, Novus Ordo, etc. They are not the shepherds of the church. They are schismatics and heretics outside the church. Okay? They're not the Catholic hierarchy. So-called Sedevacantists, so-called priests and bishops are not the Catholic hierarchy. Now we'll look at an article from TCW. Anyone who's honest with themselves knows this is true, right? If you believe the truth, of course, you know this for sure. 99% of Sedevacantist, so-called priests and bishops are heretics. They profess either Fenianism or indifferentism. That's basically true for like almost all of them. They're either Feniates or indifferentists. That's it. I've never personally met one that could clearly articulate the church's teaching. Never. I've not met a single one of them. There are only two that I spoke to who did not clearly and firmly profess Fenianism or indifferentism. They were kind of like one of them. That's the difficult thing, is like these people is unfortunate because these so-called priests and stuff, I would have to say they're very incompetent because, of course, most of them teach heresy, period. So that's just incompetence right there to begin with. But even the ones who don't seem to like clearly and firmly profess heresy are still not, I guess, educated enough and do not have a clear enough understanding of the church's teaching on salvation. There's no reason why in the middle of an apostasy, when the entire world is heretical and godless and blasphemous and teaching garbage about salvation, that you should claim to be a Catholic priest and not be diligent in understanding the church's teaching on salvation. That doesn't seem reasonable to me, right? There's no reason why a layman like myself should understand the church's teaching on salvation better than you who claim to be a Catholic priest. That's just no, especially today when you're surrounded by nothing but heresy. That should be the main thing you seek to understand, claiming to be a Catholic priest, because you should equip yourself with the ability to properly educate your parishioners, or so-called parishioners, however you want to say it. And like one of the so-called priests I spoke to, the only thing I can say is that he didn't clearly profess indifferentism or Fenianism. And when I expressed the true position to him, he, agreed with me. But I can't say I had a strong confidence in his agreement because he didn't seem like he was confident in knowing the church's teaching. It was kind of like I had to pull teeth to try to get a clear answer out of him. I shouldn't have to do that. I shouldn't have to pull a so-called priest's teeth to get him to say what the church teaches, man. That's ridiculous. And then there's a second individual I spoke to who, like, he, once again, he didn't clearly profess Fenianism or indifferentism, but I had to pull teeth to get him to finally say something clear. And he seemed to agree with the truth, but his understanding was so hazy. You know, he couldn't articulate it clearly, which is not good. You shouldn't be walking around calling yourself a Catholic priest during the Great Apostasy, surrounded by nothing but heretics teaching that, you know, pagans and Protestants go to heaven, and you don't understand what the church teaches on salvation. There's a problem with that. There's something wrong with that. You shouldn't be walking around incompetent on salvation and calling yourself a Catholic priest, man. No. A layman, perhaps a layman, I can be like, okay, a layman, just believe the truth, and, you know, you're just a layman. You're not obligated unless God, you know, specifically wants you to be like, you know, some expert on certain subjects. But you're calling yourself a Catholic priest and you don't know what the church teaches on salvation, or at least you can't articulate that clearly to a layman who wants to, you know, who's asking you about it. That's a problem, man. That's a problem. Something's very wrong with that. And regarding that second person, well, I mean, the first person, I guess I could say their name. The first person is called, quote unquote, Bishop Masick. They're actually they work with the Gabriel Tethero guy, who is definitely a Feniite heretic. And God willing, we'll cover his heresy later in this presentation. But the quote unquote Bishop Masick guy, when I spoke to him at least, you know, didn't seem to be a Feniite, which is weird because I'm like, okay, I didn't say this, but I'm like, no, I'm thinking back. I'm like, these people, they don't even have true zeal for the church's teaching, because let's say Masick, right? Let's say Masick believes the truth about salvation. He's not a Feniite or an indifferentist. Why then would you be working closely with a Feniite who's teaching heresy? You know what I mean? So although he wouldn't be an indifferentist in terms of salvation, his belief on salvation, he would be an indifferentist in the sense of not having, you know, a proper aversion to someone teaching heresy. He would be indifferent in that regard, you know, in a more, I guess, secular meaning of the word. And then the second person, I don't want to say their name because, as far as I recall, they like really, really don't like being, I guess, the subject of public attention, or like, you know, kind of like, I guess, criticized publicly, you know, like, for example, they didn't contact the Diamonds because they didn't want the Diamonds to like make a video, you know, condemning them and stuff like that, you know? So out of, I guess, a certain degree of, I guess, charity in some regard, I won't say their name, right? For that reason. So they don't have to, I guess, suffer the public criticism that they don't want to suffer. But regardless of that, you know, me saying their name is not really even necessary because they were a Sedevacantist. So if you believe the truth, you don't have to worry about, you know, accidentally going to this so-called priest or anything, because if you avoid Sedevacantists, you're going to avoid them as long as they're still a Sedevacantist, you know? So yeah, but yeah, so what I'm saying is basically 99% of Sedevacantist so-called priests and bishops are either, well, they are heretics. 99% of them are heretics teaching Fenianism or indifferentism. And then the ones who don't clearly teach Fenianism and indifferentism, they don't really seem to understand church teaching properly, you know? So they may believe the truth, but they don't have that clear, firm understanding, or, you know, is they're not highly competent in that subject, which is a major issue. And I find it quite horrible. And it's weird because the same Sedevacantist that I spoke about in previous sections, who was, you know, basically a friend with a Feniite, and one day he'd say he knows what baptism of desire is, then 2 days later he doesn't know what it is. And he told me about the Protestant teaching people about Jesus, or talking about Jesus in his videos, and he was happy and stuff. That same person. This guy was going to, I think, Charles Maguire. he's part of the organization called, quote unquote, Saint Gertrude the Great. I honestly I'm highly considering no longer referring to these organizations like just plainly as they're calling themselves. Like, for example, the Diamonds call their organization Most Holy Family Monastery, right? And I'm like, they're heretics, man. I shouldn't just call them Most Holy Family, because that's just, it's like an insult to the Holy Family, So the so-called Most Holy Family Monastery is what I'm considering starting to say, speak in that manner instead. So the so-called, St. Gertrude the Great organization, this Sedevacantist guy was going to their so-called masses, I believe, for many years. And he'd gone to several quote unquote masses by this Charles Maguire guy who claims to be a bishop. And I personally emailed Charles Maguire. We're going to cover this in a later section, but I'm just going to give like a brief point here. I personally emailed Charles Maguire about salvation to ask his belief on salvation. And he responded professing indifferentist, blasphemy, and heresy, right? And the guy, the same Sedevacantist, was like, very troubled, and he was shocked, and he was, disturbed by it and stuff. And he told me, like, basically, he apologized for not having investigated Charles Maguire's beliefs himself before. And I don't remember if I said this to him. I don't recall if I said this to him, but how could you go to someone's so-called mass in the midst of the great apostasy, where basically all these people are just heretics and blasphemers and pagans and stuff, and not inquire diligently as to what they believe before you go there? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. That makes no sense. But all right, let's continue here.